So let's talk big guns, bolters, melters and plasma versus buzzing chain blades, crackling power weapons and murderous power claws, with some thoughts on range versus melee in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about shooting units and close combat in Warhammer 40k 10th, the two main ways that armies deal damage these days, and for this one I thought it could be interesting to talk through some of the pros and cons of both. In the Warhammer 40k universe, both ranged and melee weapons tend to have at least a fairly equal weighting in terms of how much they're developed in the lore. I feel like sometimes ranged weapons maybe get a bit more focus, perhaps for things like Imperial Guard narratives that are maybe trying to have a bit more analogues to maybe war as we'd understand it these days, that might have more focus for the ranged weapons of Warhammer 40k. They're often the absolute focal characters and the mightiest ones of the setting, will usually tend to fight more in glorious close combat. I guess just having a bit of a fun out and out cool factor, harking back to more ancient real world combat but dialed up to 11 with Warhammer 40k tech, with power weapons and jump packs and chain blades and things. As a result of both of them being rather important, people generally want to have both of them represented well on the tabletop, and in 10th edition I feel like Games Workshop's done at least a fairly good job of making both of them really quite good for their respective roles, though dealing damage in range and melee certainly has its advantages and disadvantages. In a quick snap channel poll before making this video, I asked you guys if you had to choose one or the other, would you choose range or melee in Warhammer 40k and why? It seems that for 10th edition melee very much seems to be in ascendancy, 56% of people choosing that, with 44% choosing range. There's not really a lot of alternatives given psychic isn't really so much of a thing in 40k 10th edition, and people gave various different reasons, I feel like beyond the actual gameplay ones, with people preferring the predictability or the sheer carnage and interesting things that you can do with close combat. I do feel that there's generally a bit of a sense of melee close combat perhaps being a little bit more fun overall, often high risk, high reward, and pretty good fun with moving your units to viscerally tear down the enemies right up close and personal. It's interesting that when I asked this same question back in 9th edition, the results seemed to skew to range a bit more. Then it was 52% range and 48% melee. I'm not really sure what's tipped the balance there, though it does feel like in 10th edition that plenty of units and armies can skew really quite heavily into melee if they want to. In past editions, things have definitely skewed one way or the other in quite big ways. I'd say perhaps in 7th edition maybe had a bit more emphasis on shooting versus close combat, though there did exist some pretty powerful things to counter just pure range damage dealing, like say invisibility spells and things, and certainly shooting still tended to be the order of the day for 8th edition. I feel like that was still in the days before Games Workshop was really trying to get to grips with balancing the two, and weren't really all that great at balancing their game yet, particularly in 8th edition terrain rules I don't think helped melee at all, given that they just didn't really do all that much for shielding melee units from harm, and on a lot of boards it might just be a fairly open shooting gallery to gunning melee units off the table before they got close. In 9th edition though, they had some pretty big changes. Terrain rules got a lot more impactful, and that's maintained into 10th, and also the way that a bunch of missions were played were changed in quite a big way. I think progressive scoring objectives were quite a big one, because they meant that an army couldn't just sit back and gun line up for the first few turns and try and take down all the foes, then move out to score all the points later in the game. With a shorter game of 5 turns, and needing to score points right from turn 1 or turn 2, you'd actually have to push up and fight for the mid-board early, and coupled with terrain rules blocking line of sight a bit better, meant that ranged armies would actually have to engage and be a bit braver than they had previously. Obviously this is all talking in really general terms though, given that with points cost you could still absolutely have both range and melee units that were either over or undercosted. But it's quite nice to see that in 9th and 10th edition things haven't skewed quite so much one way or the other. We've certainly had armies right at the top of the game that can skew really heavily to one way or the other and still do well. Let's get into some of the pros and cons of melee damage and range damage in Warhammer 40k though, and we'll start out with close combat. In general, for the main positives of melee, units' melee profiles do typically tend to have better damage output overall versus say what the equivalent points of ranged firepower would be able to do, just due to the sacrifice that they have to make of getting up really close and getting their units all the way into the enemy lines, risking being shot down before they get there or needing to hide behind terrain, or risking other things like failing charges. Basically melee damage where you have to be in engagement range is going to be harder to deliver versus range damage that could shoot something from half the board away, even if terrain can make it easier. When melee units are charging into battle, another advantage they might get is that they might gain a bunch of movement and get their units in the right place to score points. Say for example, if there was an enemy unit on a primary objective, if you charged it with a close combat squad and destroyed it, then now your squad's in the right place to claim that objective. And the same could be true of certain secondary objectives as well, maybe a charge getting you in the right place to score engage on all fronts or similar. As mentioned, it is helpful for melee units to have some fairly strong terrain rules in 10th edition, with the ability to completely block line of sight for ranged units. Obviously this might vary board to board a fair bit, but certainly on lots of tournament setups you might be able to stage melee units in a fairly aggressive way, have them move into the corners of these L-shaped ruins you often see, and then have a unit that's in a very threatening position that the opponent can't do much about, all ready to charge in and tear some stuff up. The opponent might also have some big decisions as to whether or not they push units up to try and deal damage or take objectives, if it's going to put them in range of a melee unit that could just charge forward and destroy them. For other things, I guess melee units might have some more theoretical overall activations over the course of a game. In theory, you've only got 5 shooting phases, but you could have 10 fight phases overall if you have some protracted combats where neither side wants to fall back and neither side wipes out each other. That does maybe feel a bit theoretical though, given that you're going to have a turn or so to get into combat to start with, and the opponent does always fall back. I guess it's a higher potential for amount of damage over the course of the game though. The pylons and consolidations in combat, plus the declaring of different charges, could give you a bit more scope for some clever play as well. Maybe a bit more than shooting, where it's mainly more just target priority, choosing when to split fire and when to not, and order of shooting. In melee you might have the option to do other interesting things, like say wipe out a unit and then pile onto an objective or into another enemy unit, or do other clever things like charge one end of a unit so that not all of the enemy can hit back properly. A few small positioning things can make quite a big deal from time to time. You might also have the option for doing things like wrapping and trapping enemies to force desperate breakout tests if they want to fall back, or the same if they fail morale. Finally, it's probably worth mentioning rapid ingress as well. For 1 command points, that can mean that in the enemy turn you can bring a unit on from reserves. Ideally it can be something that's both safe from the enemy behind terrain, and also something that wants to get into close combat, and then in your turn you get to move out and make a very short charge, and that can be a near guaranteed way to get a squad into melee. Certainly one of the more powerful stratagems in the game, and you certainly can make use of it with ranged units, though I feel like close combat and getting units into it is maybe one of the most powerful uses. Before we get into the negatives of melee units and shooting units in general, I just wanted to give a shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold, one option for magnetic transport cases for Warhammer 40k produced in the USA. They've got a sale on for their cases that ends over the next 24 hours, so if you did want to take advantage of that, there's not so long left. Tabletop Stronghold make magnetic carry cases, a pretty common trend in recent Warhammer model storage, the idea being to put magnets on the bottom of the bases of your miniatures, then attach them to magnetic surfaces so they don't slide around, and you can fit a whole bunch of miniatures in one small space without needing bulky foam or having any damage from them rubbing on each other. You can certainly DIY your own, though if you're looking for a more purpose-built solution, Tabletop Stronghold have their mag cases, made out of really sturdy MDF with a bunch of steel sheets on the inside, and you can raise and lower those to different levels depending on the size of the miniatures that you want to transport. They also have quite a nice acrylic display sheet on the front as well, so you can see them when they're being transported and see what's where. They also have some MDF terrain bundle deals as well, if that's something you're interested in. In any case, feel free to check them out, links down in the video description. I've generally had pretty positive reviews of them, both in terms of the quality of their cases and customer service when things have ever gone wrong, and I'll cycle back to them at the end of the video to talk through the range for those interested. Check them out, links down below though, if you want to make use of that last day sale. Getting back to the melee units of Warhammer 40k though, and here are maybe some of the negatives of trying to get into close combat to deal your damage. I guess the most obvious one is just very short range, having to get your units to move up the board, being exposed to counter attacks first, either enemy charging you or being shot, and the whole charge mechanic of Warhammer 40k is definitely an unreliable one. Rolling 2d6 can sometimes be very punishing if you just get unlucky and roll a double 1 for a short charge. It's usually worth having a command point reroll on standby, but even then it's kind of painful to pay that resource just to get your models to do what they're supposed to. I feel like one criticism of 10th edition melee has often been that melee profiles tend to be at least kind of mid into really tough stuff. Things like Power Fists being strength 8 for example means that they'll still be wounding on 5s and things into tough monsters and vehicles, so without external buffs like say things like Lance or Lethal Hits, units that might have done kind of well into tough stuff in the game are just maybe a bit more mid. Plenty of big monsters and vehicles tend to have high damage profiles and higher strength, though it's pretty rare to see either damage 3 or strength 10 or more on infantry, and even certain bigger things like say this Demon Prince are maybe a little bit surprisingly lower strength at strength 8 with his big sword. With melee units, you often have to make some really quite big decisions, which sometimes could be a positive if you're swinging for a risky or big play prize and everything goes according to plan. but also it means that you might need to have particularly good judgment of whether or not one unit can handle another enemy unit or not, or if they're going to come up short. Say if you've got a big investment melee unit like some Sanguinary Guard charging into the enemy and trying to destroy stuff, and then the enemy makes a bunch of good invulnerable saves, or you've just charged them into something that they can't quite handle. It could be a pretty massive swing in the game if they get hit back hard in that close combat, and then are likely exposed to the enemy counterattack in the next turn. Melee armies do tend to have a bit more notable dependency on the terrain being at least fairly good to function in the first place. I feel like for more casual games of Warhammer 40k, it's on average more likely to be a problem to not be using enough terrain as opposed to using too much, and it can mean that certain more destructive and perhaps more fragile melee units might be a bit better in, say, tournament settings with enforced terrain, as opposed to whatever people might have set up to look nice and narrative on the table. Finally, they do feel like there's just quite a lot of rules that counter melee rather well in 40k, and maybe a few things a bit more so than ranged units. If the enemy's got cheap chaff infantry, then melee's far more vulnerable to being screened out than a close range shooting, I think, just due to movement being physically blocked by cheap units that can be standing a bit far ahead of the actual target that you want to charge. Some army rules like fights on death for stratagems can mean that a melee unit can drag down one of yours, even when you got the jump on them, and if you're doing multiple charges all over the board, things like fights first or counter-offensive again could also take their toll if the enemy's got their own melee. There's definitely some units out there that just might be a lot easier to slay at range as opposed to in close combat. Again, for counter-melee things, units might support each other with heroic intervention too. And I feel like maybe a bit more so than ranged armies. Armies with transports can be a bit tougher to handle in close combat, given that you usually only really get one activation, so you might surge out, destroy an enemy transport, and then the unit just gets out all ready to perfectly counter-attack you in the next turn. Overall, melee units and armies definitely have some massive advantages, but also some big downsides as well, and maybe take a little bit more thoughtful and careful play versus ranged. Talking of which though, let's get on to some big scary gun tanks and 40k firepower. Perhaps the biggest advantages of ranged units are nice predictable damage output, dealing damage without having to risk getting hit back in the same phase by a target that you might have overambitiously committed to. And potentially with multiple ranged units out there, you could potentially have a firebase that can adapt as it goes on through the shooting phase. Maybe if one of your units rolls a bit low and doesn't quite manage to finish off an enemy target, you might be able to pick up the slack with another one, and then each time decide how much it makes sense to split fire or try and go all for one target and ensure destruction, weighing up absolutely making sure that you get kills versus putting efficient damage profiles into the right squads. Ranged armies might be a bit better versus melee at handling outlying enemy nuisance threats perhaps. Generally for close combat armies it means that you're actually going to have to charge and destroy any unit that you actually want to get wiped out, and that might leave your units out of position, either just completely exposed or in the prime position for a counter-attack, and sometimes it just might not be worth destroying a less valuable enemy unit for that trade-off. Ranged units are generally going to be able to take them out with a bit more impunity though. Still say remaining on an objective while destroying something that's a bit further away and not necessarily having to move out further. You can still get plenty of these sort of move blocking and movement shenanigans of melee with ranged units as well. Just because they don't have good close combat profiles doesn't mean that you can't do nuisance charges. Say a big squad of horde infantry jumping up to an objective and charging an enemy gun tank that isn't realistically going to do much damage to them and swinging an objective and causing the enemy firepower problems in the process. And I guess for relevant stratagems, certain units can allow some pretty scary overwatch, which often tends to be at least some fairly consistent damage out there in 10th edition for big scary shooting units. Certainly for massive things with flamethrowers, which could cause a whole bunch of board area denial, or just situationally if say stripping off one more wound off an enemy unit will destroy it and stop a big threat from dealing damage. For downsides of ranged units in 10th edition, as mentioned, due to the shorter game with 5 turns, missions being scored progressively, and also plenty of terrain being about to hide units from line of sight, it means that unless the opponent's just walking straight out into the open or you're playing with too little terrain, ranged units will often still have to play really quite aggressively, moving forward to gain lines of sight on the things that they actually want to strike against, and also making sure that they score objectives in the early game and not just try and clean up and desperately scrape together a few victory points in the very late game. If the opponent's army is at least a fairly elite one or fairly able to hide, you might have almost nothing to shoot turn 1 as well, particularly on many tournament style maps, the vast majority of the enemy army being able to hide behind ruins and things. Another weakness for 10th edition in particular is that cover is maybe about as easy to come by as it's ever been in 40k. Big monsters and vehicles only needing to have the tiniest bit of them obscured behind the edge of a ruin or something to get that big +1 to the saves, and that can make a bunch of AP1 and AP2 weapons hit significantly less hard into tough targets. Kind of obviously ranged units aren't going to get on too well in close combat, and due to often having to push up the board and be at least fairly aggressive, that could be a real problem, not necessarily even just getting damaged by melee units, but just getting tied up and having their options greatly diminished. Things like infantry and mounted just won't be able to shoot at all if they're within engagement range, not unless they've got some sort of fall back and shoot style stratagem, pistols or special rules, and it can still be really bad news for monsters and vehicles as well. They might still be able to shoot at basically a similar sort of damage output, just with -1 to hit for being in engagement range, but sometimes for really big firepower threats that can still be a bit of a disaster, as it means that if they want to shoot, they'll need to remain in combat and not move, and that could mean they might not be able to, say, get to objectives or get line of sight on the things that they actually want to shoot, and they might still be denying shooting to the rest of the army to the thing that locked them up as well, which could also be a big problem. Finally, as with melee, there's a fair few rules that just seem to be specifically out to give ranged units a hard time. Things like lone operative rules and the stratagems that say turn off shooting at greater than 18-inch range, they can both be really big and mess with a shooting phase. As for anything that allows a unit to be some use while remaining out of line of sight as well. Maybe Eldari with a whole bunch of different ways in which they can pop out, deal some damage, and then return to behind cover. Lots of armies have got detachment stratagems and options that work better against range than against melee. Say certain detachments that give your entire army stealth or cover. They're basically sort of counter-range armies, given that those rules don't help you out against melee attacks. And maybe a slightly less common but pretty scary option is surge moves that some armies can get. The ones where you shoot a unit and then it wanders into close combat with you, maybe moving up d6 inches. Things like Accursed Cultists or Green Tide Orcs or Khorne Berserkers, for example. That means a ranged army might not be able to put some cheap chaff or a ranged threat on a mid-board objective to outscore the enemy and then shoot that enemy unit without it jumping into close combat with you. In general, ranged units and armies definitely have a bunch of good stuff though, being able to mainly fairly safely and reliably inflict damage from a fair way away, though perhaps getting some greater damage output for the units that either need to get close or have kind of random damage or both. They can be very flexible with planning out a shooting phase to gun things down in priority of what needs to go first, though balance that all with the difficulty of getting line of sight on things, needing to push up to score, not wanting to get tied up, and any of the special rules that hinder shooting specifically. Overall, I feel like the trade-offs are interesting enough and kind of make sense for the most part, and I feel like the system is at the moment that if you've got some adequate terrain, then ranged and melee units can be really quite well balanced. It's more of a case of the individual army points, costs, and value that can make a ranged unit do better than a melee one. I feel like in general with Warhammer 40k there's really quite a lot of armies that play in a slightly hybrid way at the moment. Even certain armies like Blood Angels, for example, maybe going for a whole bunch of melee things, but then having some scary Space Marine firepower to back them up. Maybe the same with things like Chaos Marines, and even Orcs are going for some fair mixes of shooting and melee at the moment with their Tank Busters, Flash Kits and Tactical Brigades. In general though, I feel like there's often just a fair bit of value in having a small contingent of either ranged or melee in an otherwise dedicated army. Maybe for one example could be this Ultramarines list that went undefeated in a tournament recently, the vast majority of the army being really quite ranged focused with a bunch of scary Vindicators and Ballistas Dreadnoughts, but then it just so happens that the Ultramarine special characters in Guilliman and Calgar can absolutely handle a whole bunch of scary stuff in a fight, and it maybe means that the opponent can't just afford to absolutely barrel towards all the threats and try and tie them up, as otherwise their important stuff is going to get countercharged in quite a meaningful way. Maybe similarly, here's a World Eaters Vessels of Wrath list from a month or so back. World Eaters are often an army that can very happily go basically entirely melee and do so excellently, but this player decided that there was room for a couple of Predator Destructors despite not being particularly overwhelming units in any way for World Eaters. Maybe helpful for clearing out some screens or softening up some targets that are ready for melee damage, or being quite good units for reaching out and striking things that aren't worthy of the attention of a big expensive Khorne unit. I thought it would be interesting just to take a look at army win rates as well, and perhaps which of the armies tend to skew a little bit more to range or melee. And it does feel that there's a fair amount of representation for both dedicated range and dedicated melee at the top and the bottom of the 40k meta right now. I admit that these ones are all really quite arbitrary rankings, and you could play a whole chunk of the armies skewing towards range or melee, but this is just a very rough approximation of what one of their top lists does at the moment. Arguably the very top army in Warhammer 40k at the moment is a melee one in Slaanesh Demons Legion of Excess. Though for other scary threats out there's a fair bit of range stuff at the moment. Imperial Knights, maybe with a bunch of guns. They certainly have their own melee threats in the Warglaves and some of their big knights. Necron's Starshatter arsenal is a bit more range focused versus melee with its Doomsday weapons. Custodes may be a bit more melee focused versus range, though can do a bit of both with Solar Spearhead. Guard and Deathwatch maybe having a bit more of a range slant versus melee, Blood Angels more so melee versus range, and Death Guard maybe being a bit hybrid, maybe having some of their most scary damage threats at close range, but they can still put out a fair bit of firepower with some of their gun tanks and demon engines. Overall, currently I would say that the mix is fairly adequate, with both representation for ranged and melee armies at the top and the bottom of Warhammer 40k. And broadly speaking, in 10th edition, it doesn't tend to be the single biggest factor in determining whether or not an army is strong or not. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below though. Are you more of a fan of ranged combat in Warhammer 40k or melee combat, and why? And if you have a bit more of a hybrid mix of it in your army, do you have a slant towards one or the other? Finally, just to round out the video, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold. As mentioned earlier, one option for magnetic carry cases with a 25% off sale that ends tomorrow. For their mag case options, these are the amount of miniatures that you can fit on one tray, around about 90 odd small infantry or maybe 6 knight armigers. And then those trays go into mag cases of various different heights. The mini one here, maybe a bit more of a skirmish style one, though still chunky enough to fit some big land raiders and things in. This one's £72 or $75, including shipping, but there might be import duties and sales tax on top of that. This one's the regular mag case, a fair bit taller as you can see by the Chaos Knight on the bottom there. I'll leave the dimensions on the screen here, and they all come with magnets to attach to the bases of miniatures. They have a super big one which is more whole army size, and there's options for the amount of trays that you want, which can make it a fair bit cheaper or less. This one's modelling that acrylic sheet on the front as well. And then finally, with their MDF skills, they've also got a competitive terrain set as well, where there's a few discount bundles that come with that alongside the carry cases. Could be a good option if you want a fairly cheap and effective whole table worth of terrain. In any case though, feel free to check them out, links down in the video description, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. I'll leave that one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, tending to have new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel, check out the discount affiliate links in the video description and the channel's Patreon page as well. A big thank you to anyone supporting via those. But in any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.